Picture a drag strip in 1971. Two identical cars, identical engines. One finishes 0.2 of a second faster. Why? Because the winning car is missing a gear entirely. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about vintage drag racing secrets. If you're someone who loves discovering how old-school mechanics outsmarted the rulebook, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, here's the thing about super stock racing in the early 70s. The NHRA rulebook was essentially a giant, terrifying wall of text designed to keep everyone playing fair. You couldn't just bolt on a massive supercharger or run aerospace-grade rocket fuel. You had to use factory-equipped parts. But racers being racers, they didn't see a rulebook. They saw a puzzle. And no one solved that puzzle quite like Herb McCandless. Now, you might be thinking that to go faster, you obviously need more parts, bigger carburetors, wilder camshafts, maybe shoving a huge displacement engine into a lightweight chassis. But here is what most people don't realize. Sometimes the ultimate performance upgrade is actually a subtraction. This is where it gets really interesting. McCandless campaigned to Plymouth in the super stock class, and he was absolutely obsessed with time slips. He didn't just look at his elapsed time, he looked at every tiny segment of the run, and he noticed a glaring issue. He was losing precious milliseconds every single time his car shifted gears. His car ran the legendary Chrysler A727 TorqueFlite. If you know anything about Mopar history, you know the A727 is basically the holy grail of 3-speed automatics. It was an absolute tank. Chrysler introduced it back in 1956 to replace the old 2-speed PowerFlite. And by the time the big blocks rolled around, the A727 was handling over 500 pound-feet of torque right out of the factory. To give you a relatable analogy, putting a stock TorqueFlite behind a race engine was like bringing a sledgehammer to a delicate glass-cutting competition. It was overkill, but it worked flawlessly. The Chevy guys were running 2-speed power glides, which were great, but they would practically grenade under that kind of torque without serious and expensive modifications. The TorqueFlite used a Simpson gear set with a 2.45-to-1 first gear, a 1.45-to-1 second gear, and a direct drive third. It used 3 multiple disc clutch packs and 2 bands, all bathed in Dextron fluid. It was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering. But every time that masterpiece shifted from first to second, and then from second to third, there was a momentary drop in engine RPM. It was a tiny interruption in power delivery. The engine had to stop pulling, the clutches had to engage, and the engine had to build that RPM right back up. We are talking about maybe 0.15 to 0.20 seconds per shift. According to track data from that era, losing 0.2 of a second is like losing by a mile. You might as well just pack up your trailer and go home. McCandless realized that the Chevy guys with their power glides were only suffering through one shift interruption. They gave up the mechanical advantage of a middle gear, sure, but they kept their momentum. In a quarter-mile drag race, momentum is everything. So McCandless sat in his garage and thought, what if I just make my 3-speed transmission a 2-speed? The NHRA rulebook specifically stated you had to run a Chrysler transmission in a Chrysler car, but, and this is the massive loophole he drove right through, it didn't explicitly say how many of those internal gears actually had to function. The sheer brilliance of this is staggering when you really break it down. To understand what he did, you have to understand the intermediate clutch. Inside the TorqueFlite, the intermediate clutch pack is what engages second gear. If that clutch pack isn't there, the transmission cannot physically shift into second. It will try, find absolutely nothing to grab onto, and default to the next available gear, which is third. So late one night, McCandless drops the pan on his A727. He pulls the valve body out. He reaches up inside and completely removes the intermediate clutch pack. The friction discs, the heavy steel plates, the pressure plate, the return springs, he just tossed them all on a workbench. Gone. He then took a few drill bits and some epoxy and modified the valve body to permanently block the hydraulic passages that normally fed fluid to that now missing clutch. Because there was no longer a 1-to-2 shift, he ripped out the accumulator spring for it. He then carefully recalibrated the governor valve to trigger the shift directly to third gear at the exact RPM he wanted. But he wasn't completely reckless. He knew that shifting directly from a steep 2.45 first gear all the way to a 1.0 third gear was going to be a massively violent event. The RPM drop was going to be huge. All of that sudden mechanical stress was going to be transferred directly to the direct clutch pack. Normally, the direct clutch only handles the mild shift from second to third. Now, it was going to take the full, unfiltered, brutal force of a massive RPM drop. So Mechanolist crammed extra clutch discs into the direct pack. Where the factory used 4 friction discs, he machined the drum and stuffed in 6, sometimes even 7, just to give it the surface area it needed to survive the hit. The first time he took this mechanical Frankenstein out to Orange County International Raceway to test it, the results were mind-blowing. He launched the car, first gear pulled hard, multiplying the torque beautifully. Then, right at 5,500 RPM, the transmission completely bypassed second gear and slammed right into third. The engine RPM dropped massively, from 5,500 all the way down to 3,200. That is a 2,300 RPM drop in a single instant. Normally, a shift would only drop the engine about 1,500 RPM. The car violently jerked forward. When he got his time slip, his 60-foot time was exactly the same, but his quarter-mile elapsed time was 0.18 seconds faster. He had just found the equivalent of a 20 horsepower increase, and he hadn't even touched a single bolt on the engine. He did it entirely through subtraction. Word of this incredible modification didn't stay hidden for long. Mechanics talk, and soon the entire California Mopar community was buzzing about the missing gear trick. Dick Landy, a massive name in the sport, started running it. The legendary Sox and Martin team began testing 2-speed TorqueFlites in their own cars. The track officials were completely baffled at first. Cars that sounded like they were bogging down halfway down the track were suddenly trapping at higher speeds and posting incredibly low elapsed times. The physics were undeniable. By eliminating the mechanical delay of that secondary shift, they were keeping the tires planted and the car moving forward. It actually acted like a crude traction control system, shocking the tires just enough to hook up on the sticky track surface. Chrysler's own corporate engineers in Detroit eventually caught wind of what these rogue California racers were doing to their meticulously designed transmissions, and they were absolutely horrified. They had spent millions developing their flawless 3-speed automatic perfectly. The engineers in Detroit were about to have a collective meltdown. They had spent years perfecting the 3-speed automatic transmission. Now these rogue racers were completely gutting it. Internal documents from 1971 show that Chrysler actually took this 2-speed Frankenstein into their own pristine testing facilities. They strapped it down to a highly advanced chassis dyno to perfectly simulate brutal drag strip conditions. The final results were absolutely terrifying for any mechanical engineer. The direct clutch pack was seeing violent engagement speeds and torsional loads that completely shattered their original factory design limits and safety margins. The input shaft was violently twisting under the sudden immense pressure. The torque converter was literally cavitating from the massive unexpected speed changes. They decided to run it for 50 consecutive passes, just to see exactly what would happen. On run number 37, the direct clutch pack failed catastrophically. It basically welded itself together into a solid lump of useless twisted metal, locking the expensive transmission permanently in third gear. The fluid temperatures aggressively spiked to 340 degrees Fahrenheit. For context, the absolute maximum safe operating temperature was set at 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Under microscopic examination, the forward clutch drum showed severe stress cracks forming along the edges. It was a complete disaster from a traditional engineering standpoint. Now, you might be thinking, if the transmission literally destroys itself after 37 short passes, why on earth would anyone choose to use it? Here's what most people don't realize about the psychology of a dedicated drag racer. They do not care about 50 consecutive passes. They only care about holding up a shiny gold trophy on Saturday night. If going 0.18 seconds faster means breaking parts, so be it. If you have to rebuild your heavy transmission every 20 runs, that is simply the accepted cost of doing business at the drag strip. It is exactly like an astronaut worrying about the massive rocket boosters falling off into the dark ocean. They did their crucial job to get you into orbit, and you don't need them anymore. Herb treated internal clutch packs the exact same way most ordinary people treat cheap spark plugs. He developed a rigorous fast pit routine. He would make 5 passes, slide underneath the hot race car, drop the transmission pan, and inspect everything carefully. He would swap those burnt clutches out right there in the track dirt. A fresh set of special friction discs cost him about $40. Winning a major national racing event paid out $500. The financial math made perfect, undeniable sense. As more aggressive racers adopted this brutal subtraction method, the crazy modification naturally started to evolve quickly. Racers are brilliant innovators by absolute necessity. They quickly realized that standard factory materials simply could not survive the intense daily abuse. Some smart guys discovered that using chemically treated, clean steel plates significantly reduced the massive heat buildup inside. Others started experimenting heavily with mixing completely different friction materials together. They would stack 3 Alto Red Eagle discs with 3 Ribestos Blue Plate Special discs to get the perfect reliable hybrid of initial bite and sustained friction capacity. Suddenly, they were easily getting 20 full passes out of a single clutch pack, instead of just 5 short ones. The exact science of the shift point also became an absolute consuming obsession. Herb originally shifted at 5,500 revolutions per minute, but he kept meticulous, obsessive written notes on every single pass he ever made down the track surface. He quickly found that shifting too early, say around 5,400, would dramatically bog the powerful engine down in high gear. Shifting too late, past 5,700, meant he over-revved and moved completely past his engine's peak power band. The absolute sweet spot for his specific mechanical combination, depending heavily on daily air density and track surface temperature, was exactly 5,550. He would adjust the tiny little governor weights inside the dark transmission case to hit that precise high mark perfectly every single time he raced down the long quarter-mile drag strip. This is where it gets really interesting, because the large automotive aftermarket industry clearly saw what was happening and quickly decided to instantly cash in. A popular company called Transgo, which specialized exclusively in transmission shift kits, actually started mass-producing a commercial retail kit for this exact two-speed conversion. They aggressively marketed and widely sold it as the new TF two-speed kit. For just $89.95, you got a highly modified valve body separator plate, the necessary blocked fluid passages already carefully drilled out, and very detailed step-by-step installation instructions. It showed you exactly how to safely gut your own expensive transmission. They slapped a massive disclaimer reading "for off-road use only" prominently on the cardboard packaging, and successfully sold over 300 of these unique kits in 1972 alone. It was an absolute massive gold rush for clever transmission builders everywhere. But while the super stock racers were getting significantly faster and the aftermarket companies were getting much richer, the strict racing tech inspectors were getting incredibly nervous. The super stock racing class was originally strictly designed to only showcase realistic factory street performance levels daily. It was supposed to be a pure, honest battle of what you could buy directly off the local showroom floor. Heavily tuned, yes, but fundamentally factory equipment. Now it was rapidly turning into a masterclass in extreme transmission trickery and blatant rulebook exploitation. The official racing rulebook clearly stated that all factory-equipped components had to be retained within the vehicle always. But as the racers loudly argued while standing in the tech inspection lanes, they were absolutely retaining a Chrysler transmission. They were just creatively choosing not to use all of the gears inside of it right here today. The controversy exploded at the 1972 Winter Nationals. Herb had just absolutely dominated his Pacific racing class, running in a blistering 11.42-second elapsed time at exactly 117 miles per hour. Look, in those days, running an 11.4 in a heavy superstock car was like breaking the sound barrier in a propeller plane. It was an astonishing feat. But as soon as he crossed that finish line and pulled into the impound area, a furious competitor filed a protest. The frustrated competitor pointed a finger directly at Herb's car and loudly demanded that the NHRA tech officials completely tear down that suspect automatic transmission right there in the dirt. Now, you might be thinking that tearing down a hot transmission in the middle of a busy racetrack is a massive hassle, and you would be right. but the officials had absolutely no choice but to drop the fluid pan and look inside the casing. When the inspectors pulled that modified valve body down and shined their flashlights up into the aluminum cavity, they were completely stunned. They saw the glaring empty void where the crucial intermediate clutch pack was supposed to be sitting. The rulebook did not explicitly prohibit safely removing internal transmission components at that moment, but this drastic subtraction clearly violated the intended factory spirit of the Super Stock class. The officials were completely paralyzed by this massive technical loophole. They actually had to place frantic long-distance phone calls directly to the main NHRA corporate headquarters in California. They spent 3 agonizing hours intensely debating the exact legal definition of a functioning factory transmission. Finally, they emerged from their closed-door meeting with a heavy-handed ruling. Herb was allowed to keep his hard-earned Winter Nationals class victory and the shiny trophy because technically he had not broken a written rule that day. But, effective immediately, every single automatic transmission competing in the Super Stock class must actively utilize every single forward gear ratio originally designed by the vehicle manufacturer. The massive 2-speed TorqueFlite advantage was simply deemed too great for fair competition. It was rapidly turning the prestigious factory class into a bizarre sideshow about who could best gut their transmission, rather than who actually possessed the absolute best combination of matched factory engine parts. The official sweeping ban was permanently added to the 1973 NHRA rulebook under Section 8.4.3. It boldly read that the removal or disabling of any clutch pack, band, or internal gear set is strictly prohibited forever. The harsh penalty for deliberate violation was immediate disqualification and a possible lengthy suspension from all NHRA competition events. Here is what most people don't realize about racing bans. Banning a highly effective part does not magically erase it from existence. It usually just makes it infinitely more legendary. The cat was officially out of the bag. While the strict NHRA Super Stock racers were forced to painfully reinstall their heavy intermediate clutches, the massive world of local bracket racing immediately welcomed the brutal 2-speed modification with wide open arms. Bracket racers competed under a completely different set of flexible rules, and they instantly recognized the sheer genius of eliminating a costly shift. Street racers, who obviously ran under absolutely zero official rules out on the dark midnight highways, made the gutted TorqueFlite their absolute standard practice for late-night money races. This is where it gets really interesting. The sweeping technical legacy of this massive Chrysler innovation quickly extended beyond just the dedicated Mopar guys. Ford racers nervously watched the TorqueFlite guys dominating, and they immediately started experimenting with their own tough 3-speed C6 automatic transmissions. They began removing the intermediate clutches in the exact same subtractive way. The concept of addition by pure subtraction was spreading like a massive mechanical wildfire across the United States. Ironically, the dedicated General Motors racers who had been successfully running reliable 2-speed power glides for years suddenly had a psychological revelation. They watched Chrysler guys violently converting 3 speeds into 2 speeds, and they realized that maybe having that extra mechanical gear wasn't such a terrible thing, provided you could make it shift incredibly quickly. So, the GM guys literally started figuring out ways to add aftermarket gear sets to their 2-speed power glides to transform them into 3 speeds. The massive global transmission building industry learned incredibly valuable, tremendously expensive lessons from these wild 2-speed garage experiments. They were desperately forced to quickly develop significantly better friction materials that could actually handle those extreme engagement speeds without instantly melting into a useless puddle of burning slag. They intelligently designed much stronger, thicker steel clutch drums that could safely accommodate more friction discs without violently shattering under massive torsional pressure. They meticulously created highly sophisticated valve bodies that could consistently produce much quicker, noticeably firmer shifts without the terrifying harshness that routinely destroyed expensive internal drivetrain components. Many of these absolutely incredible underground drag racing innovations eventually found their direct, profitable way right into the modern high-performance street transmissions we happily drive today. art car who would later become one of the most highly respected and widely sought-after custom transmission builders in the entire long history of American drag racing, openly credits this specific two-speed modification as a massive historical turning point. Cart clearly stated in a famous published interview that Herb actually showed them that they were completely thinking about automatic transmissions all wrong for decades. They were constantly trying to make them shift significantly smoother and much softer, when they actually should have been desperately trying to make them shift significantly less often. That profound mechanical revelation permanently changed absolutely everything about how the entire racing aftermarket industry approached complex transmission modification. It completely exposed a fundamental, undeniable, and beautiful truth about pure professional drag racing engineering. Sometimes the best engineering solution isn't the most elegant one. Chrysler's massive team of highly educated corporate engineers had spent millions of dollars and countless hours creating a highly sophisticated, beautifully smooth 3-speed automatic transmission with carefully calculated gear ratios. Herb turned it into a brutal, violent 2-speed that violated literally every single established design parameter on their blueprints. But it was undeniably faster where it actually counted most, right out there on the sticky drag strip. Now, you might be thinking, if fewer shifts are inherently better for quarter-mile racing, then why do modern high-performance cars have 8, 9, or even 10-speed automatic transmissions today? It seems like modern automotive engineering completely contradicts this entire old-school racing philosophy. But here is what most people don't realize about modern computer-controlled transmissions. They actually validate Herb's original theory in a completely different, highly technological way. These modern multi-speed transmissions are specifically designed to shift so incredibly quickly, often in less than 100 milliseconds, that the actual time penalty for changing gears is practically zero. Look, it is basically like comparing an old mechanical film camera to a modern digital sports camera. The old camera had a physical shutter that took time to physically open and close, interrupting the shot, just like an old 3-speed transmission interrupting power. The modern camera fires off frames so fast you do not even notice the tiny interruptions. Because modern cars shift so blazingly fast, they can afford to have 10 gears, keeping the modern engine operating in an incredibly narrow, highly optimized power band constantly. They use massive computing power and lightning-fast solenoids to achieve through advanced technology exactly what Herb achieved through sheer mechanical elimination. This is where it gets really interesting, because the specific technical details of this illegal 2-speed modification actually became significantly more sophisticated deep underground over time. Even though it was strictly banned in Super Stock, the outlaw racers kept quietly perfecting the dark art of the missing gear. They quickly discovered that the physical size of the tiny fluid orifice feeding the direct clutch could be carefully enlarged to dramatically speed up the harsh engagement. A 0.093-inch drill bit was the standard starting point, but some absolutely crazy racers went as massively large as 0.125 inches. They also figured out that the tiny metal check ball sitting inside the complex valve body, which controlled the hydraulic release of the forward clutch, could be easily swapped out and replaced with a significantly lighter one. This allowed for a much quicker pressure release. The accumulator spring for the one remaining shift could be heavily shimmed with metal washers to massively increase line pressure, creating an even more positive neck-snapping engagement when it slammed into high gear. But with all of this brutal engagement came a massive, unavoidable enemy: extreme heat. Temperature management quickly became absolutely crucial for anyone brave enough to run this violent 2-speed setup. The extreme clutch engagement naturally generated enormous, transmission-destroying heat in a matter of seconds. Herb eventually had to bolt on a massive external transmission fluid cooler with exactly twice the cooling capacity of the original stock Chrysler unit. He started running a specialized high-flow pump kit from a company called TCI that instantly increased internal fluid circulation by a massive 30%. He even started experimenting with completely different chemical fluid types. He shockingly found that running Type F automatic transmission fluid, which was specifically designed for Ford vehicles, actually provided significantly better raw friction characteristics for the brutal two-speed engagement than Chrysler's own highly recommended Dextron fluid. The Ford fluid lacked certain friction modifiers, meaning it allowed the clutches to grab much harder and much faster, reducing the destructive slipping that generated the lethal heat. When the strict NHRA ban officially came down hard, some incredibly stubborn racers actively tried to creatively circumvent the new rules in tech inspection. They would maliciously install the required intermediate clutch pack back into the empty transmission case, just as the officials demanded. But they would purposely use incredibly weak, heavily modified return springs. This meant the required clutch pack would slip continuously and absolutely never fully engage, essentially making it completely non-functional during the actual race. Others would take a massive drill press and drill the brand new friction discs completely full of large holes, dangerously reducing their critical surface area to almost absolutely nothing. The NHRA tech inspectors, however, were not entirely stupid. They very quickly caught on to these sneaky visual tricks and immediately started checking not just for the mere physical presence of all the required clutch packs inside the casing, but for their actual proper mechanical function under pressure. Herb himself eventually moved on to discovering completely other legal innovations long after the controversial ban was strictly enforced. He developed a brilliant new technique for modifying the TorqueFlite valve body to produce significantly quicker shifts without illegally removing any internal rotating components at all. His highly famous controlled leak method involved drilling incredibly precise tiny orifices in the steel separator plate to permanently bleed off just enough hydraulic pressure to massively speed up the shifts without causing any destructive slippage. This specific modification was entirely legal under the rulebook, and it rapidly became absolute standard practice for everyone competing in the Super Stock racing class. The two-speed TorqueFlite story perfectly represents a truly magical moment in American drag racing history, when pure garage innovation, strict corporate regulation, and fierce track competition violently collided. It brilliantly proved that determined racers will absolutely always find highly creative, unexpected ways to completely outsmart the rigid system. These men were not just driving cars, they were pushing the absolute boundaries of mechanical science every single weekend. They were true pioneers of subtraction. They proved that a sharp mind in a dirty garage can defeat millions in corporate funding. The legacy of this missing gear lives on today. Look, in the highly advanced world of modern automotive engineering, the fundamental principles that Herb so brilliantly discovered in his dirty garage are still heavily influencing how we build insanely fast cars right now. Now, you might be thinking that a crude, violently modified transmission from the early 1970s has absolutely nothing in common with a modern computer-controlled hypercar. But here is what most people do not realize about the evolution of raw speed. The core philosophy of relentlessly eliminating mechanical delay is exactly the same. We just use vastly different, incredibly expensive tools to achieve it now. Modern dual-clutch transmissions, which you find in Porsches and Ferraris, essentially operate on a very similar, highly evolved principle of time management. They actively pre-select the very next gear using a completely separate clutch so that the actual shift time is reduced to mere milliseconds. They eliminate the agonizing wait. Even continuously variable transmissions, or CVTs, completely eliminate traditional shifting altogether by using a complex belt and pulley system to constantly keep the screaming engine in its absolute peak power band. Furthermore, look at modern electric vehicles. Cars like the Tesla Model S Plaid or the Rimac Nevera have conclusively proven that with a massive instantaneous amount of electric torque, you actually do not need multiple forward gear ratios at all. They use a single-speed transmission. Herb was decades ahead of his time in fundamentally understanding that the absolute best transmission might actually be the one that transmits brutal power most directly to the asphalt, not necessarily the one that is the most highly sophisticated or mechanically complex. This is where it gets really interesting for automotive historians and dedicated gearheads alike. Today, surviving authentic examples of those original two-speed modified TorqueFlites are considered incredibly valuable, highly sought-after pieces of authentic drag racing history. Wealthy collectors and nostalgic racers will gladly pay massive premium prices at exclusive auctions for those original scarred valve bodies that still have the telltale epoxy-blocked passages clearly visible inside. They fiercely hunt down the heavily machined aluminum clutch drums that were custom cut to perfectly accept those extra friction discs. You can even find collectors paying top dollar for original Transgo TF 2-speed conversion kits that are somehow still perfectly preserved in their original vintage cardboard packaging from 1972. These rare mechanical artifacts are not just old, greasy car parts. They are tangible, metal reminders of a truly golden era when one incredibly clever, highly determined drag racer could genuinely outsmart an entire massive team of highly educated corporate engineers. They vividly represent a time when true, groundbreaking automotive innovation happened late at night in dimly lit garage workshops instead of inside sterile million-dollar computer simulations. Going significantly faster back then meant thinking completely differently, deliberately breaking the established norms and aggressively subtracting parts, not just aimlessly spending more money on expensive bolt-on accessories. The vibrant, fiercely competitive California Super Stock racing scene of the early 1970s was absolutely never quite the same after the infamous two-speed ban was permanently enacted. Professional drag racing inevitably got significantly more expensive, vastly more technologically sophisticated, and heavily, strictly regulated by corporate interests. But for a brief, truly glorious period in American motorsports history, Herb McCandless and his fellow brilliant innovators conclusively showed the entire world that sometimes the absolute best, most effective vehicle modification is a brutal subtraction, not a shiny addition. They undeniably proved that deeply understanding the fundamental physics and mechanical principles behind the corporate engineering mattered significantly more than blindly accepting that expensive factory engineering as absolute gospel. And they beautifully demonstrated that in the high-stakes world of professional drag racing, just as in everyday life, the absolute shortest, fastest distance between 2 points is not always a perfectly straight, predictable line. Sometimes the smartest possible move you can make is just aggressively skipping a gear entirely. What made this specific innovation truly remarkable, and why we are still talking about it over 50 years later, was not just its brutal effectiveness on the racetrack, but its beautiful, elegant simplicity. In an era when most racers were desperately adding increasingly complex components, bolting on bigger carburetors, installing wilder camshafts, and running highly volatile additional fuel systems, McCandless was quietly removing heavy pieces and throwing them in the trash. He understood something fundamental, something pure that almost everyone else completely missed. In a violent, loud race that is strictly measured in tiny fractions of a second, every single fraction counts immensely, and sometimes the absolute best, most reliable way to save precious time is to completely eliminate unnecessary mechanical steps entirely. His legendary two-speed TorqueFlite did not just permanently change how professional racers thought about automatic transmissions, it fundamentally changed how they creatively thought about mechanical problem-solving itself. The NHRA's sweeping, historic ban on the two-speed modification proudly stands as one of the most highly significant, deeply controversial technical rulings in all of superstock racing history. It officially acknowledged, in permanent writing, that Herb McCandless had discovered something so brutally effective, so completely game-changing, that it legitimately threatened the entire competitive balance of the whole racing class. That is truly the ultimate, highest compliment for any garage innovation, being declared officially too good, too fast, and too reliable to be legally allowed to compete.
He outsmarted the massive Chrysler Corporation, he outsmarted the strict NHRA racing establishment, and he permanently forced them to completely rewrite their sacred rulebooks simply because he had cleverly found a massive mechanical advantage that absolutely nobody else had ever anticipated. And I genuinely mean that absolutely sincerely. This trick was perfect. Thank you for watching my video today. Subscribe right now.